Right, so last year the British public elected a Labour government on a promise of moral renewal, fairness, and social repair. It was all about change, wasn't it? That was Keir Starmer's buzzword. Among the most urgent of his pledges was a commitment to tackle the housing and homelessness crisis engulfing the country. Labour's Renters' Rights Bill was marketed as the most ambitious reform of the private rented sector in decades, and yet here we are, a year later, seeing the contradictions at the heart of this commitment being brutally exposed by a self-serving politician who is, of course, also a landlord, exemplifying the very worst of examples that you might see in a Channel 5 documentary series. The figure at the heart of this is Rushanara Ali, Labour MP and Minister for Homelessness, no less, who evicted tenants from her East London townhouse and attempted to re-let it at a rent increased by £700 a month. The homelessness minister making people homeless. Yes, I'm sure Starmer's housing legislation is going to be watertight then. Not. Right, so Rushanara Ali, the homelessness minister, making people homeless so she could hike the rent by £700 a month because she is both an MP and a junior minister who clearly can't get by without it, who can't get by on £116,000 a year or so these days. Won't you just think, the poor landlord MPs. The trouble is, Ali's actions are not an isolated scandal, but a symptom of a deeper rot. With at least 44 Labour MPs serving as landlords, more than even the Tory party, the party is structurally compromised on housing justice. The Renters' Rights Bill, while containing welcome reforms, is ultimately limited by the interests of those crafting it. So unless Labour confronts the class contradictions within its own ranks, it cannot credibly claim to represent renters, the homelessness, or working class Britain as their party was founded to do, but which today's iteration of it bears very little resemblance to that. When Labour took office, Britain was already in the grip of a housing emergency. But instead of reversing this crisis, Labour has seen homelessness soar and rents, burdens and housing inequality worsen. According to Shelter, by the end of 2024, 1 in every 160 people in England was homeless, including more than 140,000 children. The situation deteriorated further in 2025. The Centre for Social Justice reported a 20% rise in rough sleeping compared to the previous year, while almost 170 children were recorded living in temporary accommodation. A Reuters investigation from just last month underscored that the number of households living in temporary accommodation had reached record highs. Local authorities, already overstretched, faced a spiralling crisis. Expenditure on emergency housing provision surged by almost 90% over the past decade. That costs all of us more. It hits us in the public purse, much of it funneled into the pockets of private landlords offering inadequate and insecure and overpriced housing. And this has all occurred under a Labour government now that publicly promised to transform the housing landscape. Keir Starmer's rhetoric emphasised fairness and renters' rights and moral duty. Yet the gap between policy language and lived experience has just widened. Labour's failure to stop the trend, let alone reverse it, cannot be blamed solely on the Tories either, as politicians inevitably do, blaming the previous administration. It's the result of political choices and ideological and structural hypocrisy. Nowhere have these contradictions now been more viscerally illustrated than in the case of Rushanara Ali, Labour's Minister for Homelessness. In November last year, tenants in her East London property were informed that their fixed-term lease would not be renewed. The stated reason was that the home was being placed on the market. OK, fine, she wants to sell up. The tenants, a group of professionals, were told they could remain temporarily on a rolling basis while the property was up for sale. But when the sale failed to materialise, Ali swiftly relisted the property for rent at a dramatically increased rate. The monthly rent was raised from £3,300 to £4,000. That is an increase of over 21%. Extortionate is the most appropriate word, I fancy. Now, this might be the sort of behaviour you might expect from your average greed-driven rogue landlord. It's worse when it's a government minister. But when it's the minister charged with literally combating homelessness that has made her own tenants homeless, this is clearly not a serious government if such a person, a landlord, was ever given this brief. It reveals a minister whose conduct is not only out of step with her role, but actively reproduces the problem she's supposed to be solving. Had Labour's own Renters' Rights Bill already been enforced, Ali's conduct would likely have been found to be unlawful. The proposed legislation prohibits reletting a property at a higher rent within 6 months of claiming it was being sold. So the timing of the eviction and reletting strongly suggests a conscious effort to act before new rules took effect. What makes this scandal particularly egregious is not only that it reveals hypocrisy, but that it underscores the type of landlord behaviour Labour is meant to be curbing. In Ali's case, there's no attempt to claim naivety here. The decision appears calculated, opportunistic, and ethically indefensible. But her case is also not isolated. She's part of a wider group of Labour MPs and MPs across other parties as well, whose private financial interests align not with renters but with landlords. As of 2025, at least 44 Labour MPs received rental income exceeding £10,000 per year. That's more than 10% of the parliamentary party, and a higher proportion than the Tories even. According to Landlord Zone, this includes figures such as Gurinder Singh Josen and Bayo Alaba, alongside Jazz Athwal, the MP for Ilford South, who owns at least 18 rental properties. These three are in the top 5 biggest landlords in Parliament, incidentally. Athwal tops that list, and they're all Labour. Athwal's conduct, too, has raised concerns. A Morning Star investigation from last year revealed that some of his properties were plagued with black mould and ant infestations. He was later found to also be the landlord of a failing children's home by the Canary. Tenants reported unhealthy and unsafe conditions, even as Athwal publicly backed measures like Awab's Law, legislation intended to clamp down on landlords who permit uninhabitable conditions. This deep entanglement between landlordism and Labour policy making on housing is a structural problem, therefore. It has consequences. Labour will never act against its own MPs' interests to the degree necessary to really deal with the housing crisis. Policy under such a government will foster timidity and self-censorship instead. Evidence for that came all the way back in August of 2024, incidentally, as Squawk Box reported that Keir Starmer personally blocked Sadiq Khan from implementing rent controls in London, despite overwhelming public support and a clear need. Why would he do such a thing? Because such a policy would cut into the profits of the very class, landlords, to which many of Labour's MPs belong, not to mention political donors, of course. This raises fundamental questions about political integrity, therefore. Can a party with so many MPs invested in rental property credibly claim to champion renters? Can it deliver transformative housing policy while protecting the wealth of its landlord class? Can it fight homelessness while its own ministers profit from rising rents? Labour's Renters' Rights Bill has been widely hailed in the press as the most significant reform of private renting in decades. The bill includes abolition of Section 21 evictions, introduces rolling tenancies, limits rent increases to once per year. They are all important steps. I'm not saying they're not, but they fall well short of what is needed to reverse the crisis. The bill does not introduce any form of rent control. We've seen Starmer oppose that personally. It does not link rents to local incomes either. It does not establish a mechanism for ensuring affordability. While it requires that rents stay within market norms, it does nothing to address the fact that those market norms are themselves inflated by landlord profiteering, short-term lets, and speculative investment. Moreover, the bill places the burden of enforcement on the tenants. Renters must challenge unlawful increases via tribunal, an intimidating, costly, and time-consuming process. So this model assumes a level of legal literacy and financial stability that most vulnerable renters certainly do not have. Tribunal system is already under-resourced and opaque as well. Without major investment and reform, this will be a bottleneck, not a safeguard. According to Money Week, renters now spend over 30% of their monthly income on housing, compared to 26% for homeowners. Meanwhile, only 17% of renters are able to save for a deposit. These figures reveal deep structural inequality that no amount of regulatory tinkering can undo. Without redistribution of housing wealth, without public housing investment, without bold rent caps, the Renters' Rights Bill offers at best a set of sticking plasters. It is a sticking plaster policy, something Starmer has been so fond of accusing the Tories of in the past. The limitations of Labour's housing policy are not accidental. They reflect the deeper ideological reluctance to confront landlord power that's endemic in that party. This is the defining contradiction of modern Labour. It wishes to govern for renters without alienating their landlords. It wants to reform the system whilst preserving the privileges of those who benefit the most from it. It promises justice without any redistribution. Since the Blair era, Labour has embraced home ownership, buy-to-let and private market solutions as its default housing model. Even now under Starmer, the party refuses to commit to mass public housing on the scale required. It refuses to tax second homes meaningfully. It refuses to confront the city's role in turning housing into an investment vehicle rather than a social good, and a human right even. Instead, Labour hopes that landlordism can be managed more ethically. But then you get the case of Rushanara Ali, and her case proves otherwise. Even when placed in positions of direct responsibility for homelessness, landlord MPs will still act in their own financial interest. This is not a question of rogue individuals, it is systemic failure. If Labour is to become a credible vehicle for housing justice, it must make a choice. It cannot continue to serve both renters and rentiers. It must end the contradiction at its core. That means not just better policy, but structural change. They will not deliver it. This is a government of continuity, not one of change. MPs with large rental portfolios should not be permitted to legislate on housing. Parliament must introduce rules to prevent direct conflicts of interest, as has blatantly been exposed here. A public register of landlord MPs should be created and made easily accessible to all constituents. The party must commit to permanent rent controls linked to local income levels. It must embark on a programme of large-scale public housing construction with rent-capped, non-profit tenancies. Homelessness must be addressed not through enforcement or charity, but through structural guarantees, the right to housing, protection against eviction for profit, and the definancialisation of the housing system. Until homes are treated as dwellings, not assets, the crisis will continue. Labour must also confront the moral failure of tolerating landlordism in its highest offices. Rushanara Ali's position is untenable now. She must resign or be removed, in my view. Anything less sends a message to private profit, is compatible with public duty, that evictions and homelessness are acceptable side effects of political office, and that would be obscene. The scandal surrounding Rushanara Ali is not just a story of hypocrisy, and it should be noted she's done nothing illegal here. But you can't tell me it's right either. It's a diagnosis of a party in crisis. Labour is at war with its own promises. It claims to defend the homeless whilst enriching landlords. It claims to stand with renters whilst protecting rentiers. It offers regulation without redistribution, reform without rupture. They are, de facto, another Tory party. The renters evicted by their own minister are watching. The children in temporary accommodation are watching. The working class voters Labour claims to represent but do not anymore and have not done for some time are watching nonetheless. Can a party that profits from the housing crisis be trusted to end it? That's the fundamental question here at the end of the day, isn't it? As things stand, the answer is no. Not unless it has the courage to confront its own contradictions, remove those who undermine its mission, and choose unequivocally between the people who rent and the people who own. It simply will not happen. But there are alternatives. The Green Party is pledged to build 150,000 new social homes annually, introduce rental controls in line with local affordability, make housing a basic human right, insulate cold homes with a £29 billion insulation mission, all paid for via a wealth tax, which Labour will also never countenance on assets over £10 million. There are other choices we as voters can make, but unless we start to choose differently, until we stop supporting establishment parties that never work in our interests, the evictions will continue, and so will everything else that's harming our lives. So will the evasion of responsibility for it all as well. Ali should at the very least have the whip removed here, you would imagine. But as we know, that's a punishment reserved only for socialists in the Labour Party who vote against keeping kids in poverty or seeing disability support getting cut. That kind of thing, isn't it? His inaction in this case will once again expose whose side Starmer's on here. For more on Starmer's slum landlord party, particularly the case of Jazz Athwell, check out this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, sort of spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people. I'll hope to catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.